Sometimes the First World War made allies of old enemies. Russia, as a matter of fact, would soon find aid from, well, Japan, in the form of hundreds of thousands of technically obsolete rifles. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Japanese Type 30 Arisaka rifle. Let's get this elegant thing over to the light box. Weighing in at 8.7 pounds and an overall length of 50 inches, this is not a diminutive rifle. It's a big boy, but it still feels elegant and maneuverable. Anyway, we've got a magazine capacity of 5 rounds fed from a stripper clip. That cartridge is 6.5 by 50 millimeters. As is usual for this show, this rifle did not just pop out of the ether. There is some previous history to discuss, so we'll set her down and rewind the clock all the way back to 1868, when Japan was just sort of blossoming into the Meiji Restoration. This period marked rapid advancement as the Japanese went from the shogunate system back to the imperial system, and then rapidly tried to catch up with the rest of the world. Just a small part of this procedure was the founding of the Arms Office. This new branch of the government would gather up all the previous clan arsenals and weapons making factories and put them under one imperial umbrella. And as part of this, they would purchase a factory known as Sekiguchi. This was in the Kushikawa district of Tokyo, formerly belonging to the Tokugawa. This factory would become the heart of the Arms Office, and in 1870 they would permanently locate there and rename the whole affair the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal. Now, this new modern arsenal would continue to expand, and it would track right along with the rapid modernization of Japan. They started with the British Enfield, converted to a Snyder pattern. Then they would lead into their own design, the Murata, in 1880. This would be followed in 1889 by the Murata Type 22. We'll get into the details on these guys later. After the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, the Japanese authorities would realize that military conquest was paying heavy dividends, and they rather enjoyed it. All this investment in being the most advanced power in the Far East was really profitable. So they took a look at that Murata rifle again, and frankly, it was never all that advanced to begin with. It was time to consider another. Around that same time, in 1891, General Murata at the time would bring on a new and talented young man by the name of Nariakira Arisaka. Born in 1852, a fourth son of a samurai under Choshu, at the age of 11 he had taken the name of his mentor, a gunsmith by the name of Nagayoshi Arisaka. By the end of 1895, he had risen to the rank of colonel and was assigned to oversee the adoption of a new infantry rifle. Arisaka was no stranger to travel or foreign ideas, so it should be no surprise that we'll see 3 Western rifles influencing his design. First up was the Gewehr 1888, then the Mauser 1893, and finally, the Kakarno 1891. Assisted by Colonel Miyata and a civilian by the name of Mr. Hanjo, Arisaka would work those first 2 rifles into this guy right here, along with some original ideas. We'll get into all that in a moment. It would be ready for trials by the middle of 1896, and the trials would wrap up early in 1897. I wish I could give you more details on the trials gun itself. I have not been able to track down much except for some statements that barely anything was changed by the time it was officially adopted in March of 1897. Now at that time we were in the 30th year of the Meiji era, since the beginning of the Meiji dynasty as it were. So that makes this the Type 30 rifle. And by the way, if you're wondering about that Kakarno, its influence is felt in the 6.5mm small bore cartridge. 6.5 by 50 millimeters to be exact. The Type 30 cartridge used a fairly mild charge when compared to its contemporaries. Instead, the Japanese chose a flat-shooting, high-speed but still modest cartridge. while it doesn't run out to 2,000 meters as easily, we know in retrospect that reliability at 500 meters is still more than enough for this sort of warfare. There would be a lengthy pre-production period in which some little kinks were worked out of the design, but we'll cover those as we go over the rifle. This would extend out as far as October 1898, which means, you've got over a year to sort of fiddle with it. But like I said, let's take a close-up and see exactly what went into this rifle. All right away, we can tell we are definitely based off the Mauser 93. If we sort of give it a look right down the length, muzzle band, spring, the overall stock shape, the position of the handguard, this sort of ladder-style rear sight, these are all Mauser-styled features. Especially, by the way, with this ladder, this is an original one. It goes up to 2,000 meters. Now that last measurement is read from a notch at the very tippy top. Alternatively, you might find these updated to the Type 38 cartridge. Ian's video on the Type 30 actually has that updated sight, so now you can say you've seen both. Anyway, coming back on down, again, still more Mauser-like, although there's some details back here we'll talk about in just a second. Let's get a look at that bolt, all right? So, as I open this up and sort of let it move back, you're going to see what is clearly based off of the WWI 88. We have, and I'm sorry, let me reach for everybody's favorite, the patented plastic pokey hand. We have a separated bolt head. We have the small style extractor. We have a moving ejector that I'll show you in a moment on the other side. The internal sort of cocking mechanism, even though it's cock on close, is very similar to the style of the 88. We have our very unique safety back here. This is very specific to this rifle. If I close it, in a way, it's very similar to what you would see on a Schmidt-Rubin in that we pull and turn up, and then it sort of decocks down in the action, and now our lug for releasing our striker is set in a separate channel, and therefore it is disconnected from the trigger, and the gun is safe, and the hook blocks our line of sight so that we know that it is on safe very clearly and easily. There's no accidental not shooting at something that we want to shoot at. The hook is very large and a bit cumbersome and catches easily on things, but the reason it's there is so that it's very easy to recock the action if you need to, and also you want to be able to sort of do this with gross motor control. Obviously you need a digit on there, but you can put a gloved digit on there and still be successful. All right, so let's get the bolt out and look at it in a bit more detail. Now, to release it, again, kind of like our WWI 88, we have this push button release on the left side. Bolt is free. Oh, and I'm sorry, before I go any further, just make note of these gas ports up here. We're going to talk more about gas mitigation in a minute. I just want you to be aware that they're there. All right, looking at the bolt, again, we have a moving attached ejector. This strikes that bolt stop and then pops forward to kick the casing out. We have a simple bolt handle that turns down to act as a third lug. Our first two locking lugs are up here. This sets into a piece of metal at the rear of the receiver, right here. And the shape of this sort of helps you to turn that bolt down into the action when cocking on close, although it's a little more squared off than we'll see on like a later Type 38. That's another episode. Turning back to the bolt, these things are a complete nightmare to disassemble, but we'll still go through it because I love you all very much. The first thing is that we can go ahead and turn and remove the bolt head. It's just that simple, 90 degrees, and she's out. And as a matter of fact, she comes apart very neatly because we can push back the ejector's out. We can pull out on the extractor's out. That part is simple enough. The rest is a nightmare. Because we have to set back the striker in order to get any further into this. So, in order to accomplish that, you are supposed to have a special tool from the Japanese, or you can make one with the properly measured steel pipe or copper pipe. I happen to have a Lee Enfield tool, and we'll see this again when we get to that episode. And if anybody hasn't noticed, by the way, if you keep asking me about the short magazine Lee Enfield, my answer is going to be the what now. That's the only answer I've ever had for it in the comments, and it's frustrating a lot of you to death, and I love it. So keep asking, I'm going to keep saying the what now. All right, so this guy happens to fit just right so that I can put him around that firing pin and then press down on this guy. And I'm sorry, I got to keep this in camera. There we go. Now we've exposed the top of this and I can pinch on a little piece. There's like a metal tab. I'm going to pinch on that and give her a twist. And I'm going to keep twisting. And I'm going to keep compressing that spring so we don't have any trouble. And then once I've cleared all that, I can push her through, and we've got a split screw. So what happened is that thing I was unscrewing, that cap, is now in 2 separate pieces. That's released the firing pin to come all the way through the action now, which I can let off gently. So now she's out with the spring. Dun, dun, and then there's our safety. And then we got to work this guy out just a bit. There is what is essentially our cocking piece. Sorry guys, trying to show that to you. And as you can tell, this is a lot. This is a lot going on in a bolt. It's one of the big failings of this gun, is just how many pieces are in this thing. But overall, still very functional, very useful gun. It's got a couple things like a safety here so that the trigger can't be pulled unless we're in battery. We have good gas mitigation off the system, like I said before, where we've got 2 ports to help relieve any sort of ruptured cases or things like that. The gun overall is pretty safe for its time, although we're going to see some later models that have it thought out much better. All right, with that, I should probably turn back to the stock, so let me get these guys out of the way. All right, and very unique to this gun, and this is something that was found in the trials period, or not even trials period, the period between adoption and production. Japanese do not have a source, or did not have a source, of very strong stockwood, seasoned stockwood. And so they were having problems with breakages in 2 separate ways. Number one, we've got, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to make room. Boom, there we go. Number one, the way the wood is set with the grain this way strengthens the stock up until you get to the toe. And then on a lighter stock like this, you're going to have shearing where the short grain is. Well, at first they fixed this by just sort of dovetailing or replacing this piece here at the tip, and you can see it clearly on this gun that it has one of the earlier style toe doves, and later on they went to a much hardier midpoint, and I know there's a scratch here, ignore that, the midpoint is here guys, where they literally just cut away this wood and then put a dovetail in and rammed in another piece of wood with the grain going in a different direction. So that means that this whole thing is much stronger back in the toe, and you almost never see toe cracking on these stocks. So they're usually in wonderful shape. Although, with lots of changes in moisture, and if any of the finish has been worn off or anything like that, you will start to see gapping where it's really obvious. A lot of people think that it's a repair, but no, that's factory original. Now, the other thing that would happen is with the light wood and the thin wrists, they would have breakages across the wrist. The way that was fixed with 2 deep steel tangs. Look how far down this goes. So we've got a long tang here and a long tang here, and they're both set deep in the stock with screws. That makes it very unlikely for a Japanese rifle to break at the wrist. So you almost never see Arisaka of this model or later ones with cracks here or with cracking back here. They're very strong in the stock despite being fairly light wood, which by the way saves on the overall weight of the rifle. It makes them kind of elegant and more maneuverable than you would expect for the size of the gun. All right, I think that wraps up most of the details that we wanted to show closely, so I should be able to turn this over to an animation. Oh, except, hold on, one more thing, let's look closely. Sorry guys. This has a beautifully simple mag release located right here. Pops her out, and then once she's out, I just want to show you this one sort of set of unique features. This gun has a folded sheet metal steel follower, see if you can see that, how it's been folded around, and a wire spring set into sort of a box shape instead of that usual flat spring we're used to seeing. I just thought that was fascinating. As a matter of fact, you can see where it's sort of been knotted on the other side. I just think it's fabulous. All right, now I can really turn you guys over to an animation. From here, we can now see that Mauser-style trigger and sear setup. Plus, as we said before, the Gewehr 88 locking lugs, extractor, firing pin, that sort of thing. The safety hook is pulled back, turning that cocking piece into a different channel, preventing fire. Otherwise, you probably don't need me at this point, so let's wind it down. And hand it over to Mae.
We'll load 5 rounds from the stripper clip. Point and this safety is super easy to use. Slowing things down. And let's see that target. Pretty good, considering. Back to Othais.
Thank you, Mae, for that elegant demonstration. Now, the Type 30 rifles were produced exclusively by the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal. This was long before the breakup of the Japanese arsenal system. We will talk about that very, very soon. Also, I should say that in August of 1899, a carbine was introduced. It was designed for cavalry primarily, shortened to an overall length of 37.9 inches, and the rear sight was reduced to 1,500 meters. It initially didn't have a bayonet lug. Cavalry would just use their swords. But one was added by the time production started, so it could be used by other troops, transportation, signal, other specialty soldiers who didn't need a long rifle. Both the rifle and the carbine would be equipped with a new Type 30 bayonet. This monstrous knife-style 15 3/4 inch bladed weapon was fitted with a quillion. That's that hook at the front. It was used to help stack arms and as a blade catch in case of rifle fencing. Some people say that it was there as a blade breaker. Not so much. You guys might want to read up on some old Japanese pole arms, but basically it's a catch. Production of the Type 30 did not make it to high enough numbers to really see it issued in the Boxer Rebellion, although it did serve in the Russo-Japanese War. Again, this was a military triumph for Japan, and again, production was increased. Don't get me wrong, the rifle is beautiful. The rifle functions. You saw it function. However, they did note some problems. First of all, that 6.5 cartridge, it was okay. But the Japanese, especially after the war, became concerned because they felt like they were wounding more Russians than they were killing. And that was allowing them to return to the battlefield to haunt more Japanese troops the next day. And it had some problems with penetration. So that got tabled. As a matter of fact, they would start exploring a 7.7mm cartridge almost immediately after the Russo-Japanese War, but it would keep getting kicked down the road until, we'll see after we get out of World War I, it will reappear with a Type 99 rifle. Anyway, in addition to the cartridge, there were problems with the action. Number one, first and foremost, that bolt is ridiculously complicated. I mean, you saw the disassembly procedure, and you don't want to see my three-handed reassembly procedure, which made it really hard to service in the field. And it needed servicing in the field because this action is actually quite prone to dirt, sand, mud, water. And when you are a Pacific island-hopping empire, that is important. Ultimately, that means that this gun had an extremely short service life. It would be replaced in 1906 by the Type 38 rifle. That design is sublime, and as I've said twice already, we will be getting there soon, very soon. But, by the way, that Type 38 would also use the 6.5 by 50mm cartridge, although it would be adapted to its pointed round and, a little bit more velocity on it. We'll get there. The telling thing, because remember, we were looking at 7.7 after the Russo-Japanese War, but we didn't quite go there. And we wouldn't quite go there for quite a while until we're fighting in China. There's a whole story there, but probably one of the better aspects of this cartridge, one that, many Americans would complain about later on, is that the small, light, low-charge cartridge coming out of a long, long barrel like this meant that there was ample time for all the powder to burn, which means you have almost no muzzle flash on a weapon like this, which makes it ideal for entrenched troops who do not want to be spotted while firing. So good old iron sight sniping. All right, so being replaced, we're talking about 30 to 38, you can guess how many years that is. Being replaced so quickly and with such a slow build-up to production, that means that this gun only ever was produced to the tune of roughly 550,000 long rifles and roughly 45,000 carbines. Now, with those sorts of numbers right at the turn of the century, you would think that this thing was screaming towards obscurity, that would only fight in one war. But you would be neglecting the rich aftermarket use of this particular rifle. First, however, I should explain this little flower. You see, this is the Kamon, or family seal, of the Emperor. Every rifle was marked with it to declare it property of the Empire. When released from service, this seal would be overstamped, or ringed, or marked for training. If it was surrendered at the end of World War II, it could also be scratched out or ground completely off. Now, that flower, by the way, is the chrysanthemum, the seal of the emperor. And so, it's commonly in Japanese called a mon, and in English chrysanthemum, and somehow that just became mum as a nickname. So lots of people will ask you whether or not your rifle, if you have an Arisaka, still has its mum. Turning to non-Japanese use of the Type 30, I'll quickly mention the Manju Models, the 29 and the 31. These were sold on contract to the Guangxu Emperor, with the Chinese imperial years for their model number, so these would time out to 1903 and 1905 respectively. Interestingly, that gap leaves room for the Russo-Japanese War. There are some slight differences in the handguard and rear sight between the two, but we're not getting into deep detail on these today. Combined, roughly 31,000 were made. Nearly all have been lost to time and war, so these are rare. Skipping ahead a bit, I'll also point out this gun. The North China Type 30 carbine was produced after the Japanese occupation and subsequent creation of a series of ever-changing puppet states in China. It is a crude clone of the Type 30 with a unique flower marking, 8mm bore, and single-piece stock. It seems it was assembled due to overstressed manufacturing and shaky supply lines from Japan during World War II. Chinese oddities aside, let's get to the real meat of our topic, because this gun did indeed fight in World War I, but not with the Japanese. You see, these were quickly displaced by the Type 38, and Japan really didn't do major action. I mean, they definitely fought battles that were of importance, but they weren't huge rolling conflicts like in Europe, so there was no need to pull out secondary weapons that were sitting around in inventory in Cosmoline, or the Japanese equivalent of Cosmoline. These guns could happily sit on the racks for the Japanese part of World War I. But they had a new ally, an unlikely ally of an old enemy, in Russia. Both being on the side of the Entente, they needed to cooperate. And interestingly, they shared a border that was well away from the fighting. And Russia had lots and lots of men, but not a lot of rifles. I mean, this is sort of famous even into World War II, but they just had more men than material. And so they were doing things like using the old Berdan 2s, they were using French Gras that they were getting a hold of, they were using American contract rifles for the Mosin Nagant and the Winchester 1895, which we'll talk about both of those, don't worry. But that wasn't enough. They still needed more and more. And luckily, there was Japan right there, just a little ocean away, with lots and lots of surplus Type 30 long rifles. And unfortunately, because of the, Russo-Japanese War, the Russians knew that this could be a very effective rifle. So by 1915, they began purchasing lots and lots of these Type 30 rifles and even some carbines. Now, they apparently would try to keep these to the rear. I mean, you're mixing up two types of ammo. You'd rather have 7.62x54R on the front, but that's not always possible, especially because that battle in the East was a little more mobile. These things definitely got dragged up to the front line from time to time. And they certainly were serviceable enough that the Russians decided to put some investments into them in the form of some minor modification. Fat-fingered Russians stuffed into their gloves were apparently knocking the magazine base plate release button at the front of the trigger guard, so a sheet metal clip was fitted to prevent it from being nudged. Later, they would even grind the button off entirely. More and more of these guns would pour into Russia. Honestly, greater than half. I mean, quite a large percentage of the original production would end up in Russia. There were definitely more Type 30s in Russia than there were in Japan by the end of World War I, by a long, long shot. Anyway, Russia would keep piling them on, and as a matter of fact, they would keep piling on Japanese arms and supplies even after there really wasn't Russia as we knew it. Because after the Russian Civil War broke out, white Russians and allies thereof were being supplied by the Japanese way out in Siberia. Also, I should say that not just the Russians were armed with these guns. Britain would also receive a number of Type 30 and Type 30 carbines, but mostly they received Type 38s, so we'll get to that in a separate episode. Now, total receipt of the rifles from the Russians is estimated to be some 300,000 Type 30s and 30 carbines, with additional rifles afterwards. This is where it gets tricky, because by the time of the Russian Civil War, they were also starting to bring in 38s. So we can go up to about 400 to 600,000 total Japanese rifles in Russia by the end of the Russian Civil War. But we're not sure how many of those are Type 30s and how many are 38s. And we're not even sure those numbers because, man, the paperwork gets a lot messier when you don't have one real government running everything efficiently. So it's hard to say what the final total of these were in Russia. But it was a lot. Another interesting user of the Type 30 is the Czech Legion. This Entente army without a country was pitted against the Central Powers, and then it was pitted into this Russian Civil War, and then it had to wander across all of Russia, taking over train yards and things like that, until it was finally evacuated by the Japanese at the end of the war. It's a beautiful story. I highly recommend that you read up on it if you're not familiar with the Czech Legion. But as they travel across Russia, they naturally equip themselves with Mosin Nagant and 7.62 rifles, but desperate for anything they lay hands on, and with Japan as an ally at the end of that Trans-Siberian Railway, they were perfectly happy to also use the readily available Japanese Type 30 rifles and carbines that they came across. As a matter of fact, after the war, way back over in the newly formed Czechoslovakia, we would find an inventory of 57,000 Type 30 rifles, which is a little bit odd to turn up without, some of them being marched home. Other users would include things like Poland and Albania. We'll see a lot in Finland. As a matter of fact, you will find Finnish marked Arisakas, although they only totaled up to be about 20,000 before they were sort of put out to other countries. You'll see some turn up in Estonia as well. This was another attempt post-war to sort of check Russian power, but it sort of petered out after World War I. That was the last great conflict for these guns on the front line. Nadia Kira Arisaka would rise to the ranks rather quickly after this rifle, and so he, eventually making it to Baron, would never really do rifle development again, which means this is the only true Arisaka rifle. Afterwards, you'll see things like the 35 and the 38. They're going to be innovated by a man named Nanbu. We'll, again, get there eventually. But that means all this talk of the Arisaka Type 38, the Arisaka Type 44, the Type 99, all this stuff, all that Arisakaing that we're doing, that's just holdover collector's terms because it's the word that we associated with Japanese rifles some 100 years ago. It's not really all that appropriate, except for right here. All right, with all that covered, let's go ahead and hand this thing over to Mae and get her opinion on firing it. Once more, we've made room for Mae. One of these days, we'll be able to afford to get her a bigger cage where we can put the camera in there, and we don't have to risk all these breakouts and messes on the floor. Anyway, let's go ahead and get her opinion on the Japanese Type 30 Arisaka. Here you go.
Thank you. Yeah, anyway, about that. We'll talk about that later. So, first off, ergonomics of this gun. I want to point out, looks like a Mauser 1893, right? Especially from the underside. But I want to point out, it's an incredibly long gun, yet surprisingly light and well balanced. I can appreciate that. It's got thin pistol grip down here, and honestly, I love this thin wrist, and I love the fact that the Japanese wanted to keep it so bad that they elongated the tangs instead of thickening it up. It's perfect for drawing this gun back into your shoulder, retaining that grip. I did not feel it slipping at any point. Next I want to talk about is the bolt itself. It's very smooth, like a GmbH 90 or GmbH 88, excuse me. I love that action. I also want to talk about the safety. It's like a Schmidt-Rubin actually. You just pull back, rotate, and it's nice. It's in there. It kind of hides your viewpoint so that if you try to line it up with the sights, the safety is up. It's very easy to read and understand. As far as ergonomics go in this gun, this is very aesthetically pleasing for me. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, I honestly believe that when you talk about the Type 30, one of the first go-to words is going to be elegant. It's very narrow across its width. It's surprisingly light despite its length. And by the way, I mean you guys can see the measurements. It is heavy, but I don't know how to explain it. You pick it up and there's just less mass, and it's way more articulate in your hands than you'd ever expect. It's a gorgeous rifle. But we should probably get into what happens when you actually pull the trigger, because if this is such a light, wonderful, delicate, ethereal rifle, then it must be terrible once it goes bang, right?
And you, sir, would be wrong. But let's back up for a second. I want to first talk about the sights on this gun. They are very shallow, but I thought they were pretty easy to read. The trigger, I thought it's a two-stage trigger, Mauser trigger, so it's not like anything we haven't seen before, but it was smooth, it was clean, I liked it. Now, to the recoil, again, wrong. I thought the recoil was very manageable on this gun. It's kind of shoots like an intermediate cartridge. I know it's full power, but this one I thought was kind of like shooting an SKS. It was easy recoil, you can see it on the video, I had no trouble. This was a very smooth, pleasant shooter.
So far, this is sounding like a rave review. As a matter of fact, it's starting to sound like one of those guns that's going to make it up to the top of the list. But I think we should be honest here. Did you want to talk about maybe some of the problems that we had on the range?
Fine. Okay, yes, there was one problem we had on the range, and this happened with some of the ammo, not all of it or even half, just some of the ammo. The primers bulged, which caused extraction issues. Now, this extractor, I want to point out, a butterfly could fart, and it would probably have problems extracting the casing. It was having such issues just grabbing it, so we had to grab a cleaning rod and push them out. Now, granted, they fell free very easily at that point, so that wasn't a problem, but they still shouldn't have been sticking like that. So the extractor on this one, not my favorite. Now, there is a second problem that didn't occur to me personally on the range, but I could see how it'd be a problem, and people on boards have talked about this before. When mud or grit gets in the action, it can cause it to be, of course, difficult to work. And honestly, I could see how mud and grit would get in here very easily. But I want to point out, we've shot things with just as open actions before on this series, and they did okay. So honestly, I don't think that would be too big of an issue, but I'd probably have to test it out. I just didn't want to do it with this, piece because it's such in fine condition, and I don't want to necessarily dirt anything up. But yeah, just one issue realistically with this gun that we had on the range was that extractor.
For any of you who might not know what we're talking about with a bulged primer or a upset primer or something like that, what was happening is when we fired the rifle, there was room, for whatever reason, we didn't get that far into looking into the ammo or the gun or the headspace or anything like that. There was rarely on some of the ammo, the primer would set back by half a millimeter, not even a millimeter, very small increment. But that little tiny bit with that flush face bolt in this gun was enough that we could not get purchased with the extractor. We could ram it back in, pull it back out, do the hokey pokey, turn it all about, nothing. But the minute we opened the bolt and just tossed a Type 38 cleaning rod down there that we happen to have, it just touched the casing and it came right out. So the casing wasn't stuck in any way, shape, or form. It's just that the extractor literally wouldn't catch it. It was that sensitive. And I imagine if it's that sensitive just to be offset, it's probably not that strong when something's really, really stuck anyway. So, just like we saw in the episode, those worries about extraction seem to be well-founded. Okay, so we've talked about the good and the bad. Now I guess it's time to give us a real opinion. Would you take this rifle into battle?
I'm gonna have to give this one a soft no. And that's because we mentioned before the extractor having problems. In perfect weather, with perfect ammo, this would be the perfect gun, but because, like I said, the extractor and just the obvious mud and grit that could get in there, I know I've got better options out there that do better in worse conditions than this did on a great day. So for now, I'm going to give it a soft no. Plus, also, I know what's coming along for the next Japanese rifle, so that will tell us a different story later on.
I'm very sorry. May I borrow that?
Yeah.
I'm very sorry to agree. Unfortunately, there are just a few little issues with this gun, and by the way, they could have been improved out of it very easily, but the Japanese decided to go in an entirely new direction, and we'll cover that very soon. So, with a soft no for the Type 30 that still saw lots of use by Russia, we're going to wind out this episode. Don't forget to check the updates, and as always, we thank you all for watching.
Later, guys.
Alright guys, quick update. We got the 4th of July holiday, so I'm going to run around and clean house for our burger party. But, let's see, we've got Patreon funds at 2116, which is very important. We are actually taking pretty much the rest of the year off from travel so that we can save up to do some repair on the vehicle, catch up on some bills because we need to order in some special parts and things to help with the animations. If I can't remove it from a gun, I have to go get a different part and bring it in. So we have pieces of machine guns laying around so that I don't have to damage, a museum quality piece. The other thing is we are just about to launch the sale of 2 t-shirt designs. We're catching back up to those. So go ahead and check the channel for details though, because that's going to be very dependent on when you're watching this video. So I'm not going to put it all here. All right, thanks guys.